All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Abraham Lincoln, 1838.
For Lincoln, the Union was synonymous with the future of democracy. Democracy was viewed skeptically by people in most other countries of the world. They predicted that democracy would dissolve into anarchy. And that's exactly what seemed to be happening when the South seceded. But Lincoln insisted on holding the Union together because if the Union did not hold together, then all the skeptics of democracy would say, "We told you so." The world was watching. Can democracy defend itself?
Growing up in rural Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln dreamed of faraway lands.
Literature allowed Lincoln, when he was a young child, to transcend his surroundings. The great poet Emily Dickinson once said, "There's no frigate like a book to take us lands away." And how true that was for Lincoln. Though he never would travel to Europe, he went with Shakespeare's kings to merry England. He went with Lord Byron's poetry to Spain and Portugal.
Literature showed Lincoln the wider world and fueled his ambition to make his mark. As 1860 dawned, there seemed little chance he would ever fulfill his dreams. In the East, he was widely seen as a frontier bumpkin. Many thought his first name was Abram. Then, in February 1860, he spoke on the growing crisis between North and South at New York City's Cooper Union.
There was a wide feeling in New York and other parts of the East, well, okay, maybe this guy does well in the West. Maybe he does okay in those rural parts of the nation, but can he cut it in the Big Apple? He had an ill-fitting suit. His haircut didn't look like much. He just seemed out of his element and uncomfortable. But then he started to speak, and he gradually warmed up to the audience.
I will not stand by and have it expand into any new territory.
By the end of the speech, even the skeptics were standing up and cheering and shouting, "This is the guy."
Here was a man who understood the stakes and was determined to save the Union at all costs. Here was a leader. Just hours after his triumphant speech,
2, 3, 4, 5,
Lincoln visited famed photographer
7,
Matthew Brady.
9, 10.
For once, his hair was combed. He wore a silk vest and elegant coat. His gaze was simple, direct, and strong. The photo was reproduced thousands of times and distributed across the country. When Americans looked him in the eye, they saw a president. He would go on to become one of the most photographed men of the 19th century.
It was in many ways what FDR did with the radio and his ability to reach into American homes, what John F. Kennedy did with television and that image of the handsome young future president going out into American homes. Abraham Lincoln was able to convey his image through photography, a relatively new medium at the time.
We think of Lincoln as the great man who saved the Union. But in 1861, with no military or executive experience, he was ill-prepared to assume the presidency. He knew he needed help.
He had enough confidence and humility to know that the best thing I can do is to shore up my weaknesses. I don't know foreign policy. I've never been out of the country. I need Seward, who's traveled all over the place, who knows foreign policy.
England and France will not only recognize the Confederate States of America, they will feed them, arm them, and reinforce them with legions of men.
That takes an extraordinary combination, I think, of professional confidence and humility to say, I've got my strengths, and I sort of know that I'm going to be able to keep and be the master of these characters. And he was.
Grant must be replaced, sir.
I cannot spare this man. He fights.
That's the amazing thing. I don't think he worried that he'd be overshadowed. His friends said, you'll be a figurehead amidst them all. And somehow inside he's saying, no, don't worry about me. I'll be fine.
A master politician, Lincoln knew how to win friends and influence enemies. He deftly removed nearly 1,500 federal office holders, replacing them with his Republican allies. Even more, he saw into the hearts of his fellow men.
Gentlemen, who's for it?
Abraham Lincoln might well be characterized as the most brilliant politician of the 19th century. His ability to use his humor, his words, and patronage, favors, was unmatched. Lincoln was very special in his humanity, in his compassion, and in his humor, and in his ability to understand what others needed and what others wanted.
Honest Abe was far more complicated than generally understood. Reunifying the Union was always his overriding goal, and he would consider any means to reach that end.
Lincoln was thinking about a long-term plan of instituting black rights, which would have taken literally until 1900 to complete. So he was also capable of doing the politically expeditious thing of postponing black rights in order to reintegrate the South as quickly as possible into the Union. There's a lot of complexity in Abraham Lincoln.
No one had imagined how bloody, terrible, and long the Civil War would become. Over 600,000 Americans died, and untold more were maimed for life. The South had one chance at victory: to make the cost of continuing higher than the Union was willing to pay. It was a strategy that very nearly worked.
It's important to remember just how bloody this war was. And in 1864, after the terrible Battle of the Wilderness, the country is literally crying out for peace. There were peace movements every bit as great and as fervent as what we saw in the Vietnam War. And I think very strongly that if someone else were president in the midst of that terrible, terrible Civil War, they eventually would have given in and capitulated and let there be two separate countries.
Lincoln struggled to give meaning to the vast suffering inflicted by the war. In the end, he saw the losses as America's atonement for the sin of slavery.
If God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgment of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Abraham Lincoln, Second Inaugural.
The President of the United States!
In the shared sacrifices of North and South, he saw a new birth of freedom.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
It's such a brief speech. It's 3 minutes. It's so powerful in terms of Lincoln's connecting the deaths of soldiers to the larger project. These young men shall not have died in vain. What an extraordinary, brief, and yet at the same time, completely impassioned view of the sacrifice that's been made and what it's been made for.
But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract.
Somehow this man who had no education, no money, came from no background of anything meaningful, and yet he would rise to become the President of the United States. It told him that the common man profits in democracy, and that's why democracy was so worth fighting for.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
We love Lincoln not just because of his genius, although his genius was in abundance, but we love him because he embodied the common man. He embodied the American dream. And we also love Lincoln because he suffered for us. It was never easy for him to do what he did, but he gave us not only an intact union, but he freed the slaves, and he saved democracy for all time.
Let us strive on to finish the work we are in.
There was something special about Lincoln, and we knew it then, and we know it today.
George Washington really was a political general. He wasn't always the greatest strategist and tactician. He actually made a lot of mistakes early on.
If someone told you there was an American general who fought 12 battles and won 3 or 4, you'd probably ask, well, who was this complete failure as a military leader? Well, that's George Washington.
George Washington was a leader unlike any other. He wasn't a brilliant military tactician. He certainly wasn't an inspired orator. But in an age of small men who liked to talk, he towered over them with his quiet strength.
Washington's greatness was tied to his dignity. He was not only 6'2", 6'3", but he was broad-shouldered. He was a large, powerful man who stood half a head above others and a full head above many. He had a wisdom, he had a dignity, he had a stature. He always dressed immaculately. He was a bit of a clothes horse, actually, but he knew how to wear clothes that added to his dignity. John Adams later said, after watching Washington up close, that Washington was the greatest political actor he had ever seen. It's true.
Washington's leadership during the Revolutionary War was not about winning battles. Hugely outmanned and outgunned, the best he could do was survive to fight another day. For 8 long years, American soldiers endured every kind of privation. They went without clothes, shoes, ammunition, food, and pay. But somehow, Washington kept his hungry, freezing men in the battle against the most powerful empire on earth.
You are fighting for liberty, that's important, but that's abstract. That's very abstract. And you're going to have a lot of these Continental soldiers who will stay in uniform, if they had a uniform, because of George Washington.
He had this dignity, he had this strength, he had this power. He knew how to talk with people, he knew how to negotiate with people, and what he had to do was keep the states involved. New York was at the center of the war, and New York City was lost early and never regained until the end, and yet, working with Governor Clinton, he kept New York and the New York militia involved. He did that with other governors in other states. He knew how to work with them to keep them all involved and supporting the war effort when they could have bolted, they could have given up.
And what people must understand today is that when it all started out, there was very little chance that we could succeed. Very. And only a third of the country was for it. The other third was absolutely against it, and the remaining third, as so often happens, was waiting to see what happened, who came out on top. We would not have succeeded had it not been for leadership. And the prime figure in all of that is George Washington.
Washington kept his army intact long enough for the French to come to America's rescue and for England to retreat back to its shores. The victorious general immediately becomes the most powerful man in America.
And Washington, from the very beginning, set himself out as a Republican leader, that he would not maintain power. He always vowed that he'd step down as soon as the war was over. Now, many doubted this. Throughout the American Revolution, British propagandists argued to Americans, why? Why are you revolting against one King George simply to get another one?
Throughout history, rebel leaders like Caesar and Cromwell had turned into tyrants. Great military victors invariably claimed absolute power. As the Revolutionary War wound down, aides like Alexander Hamilton told Washington he had to assume power to avoid chaos. The Congress had done precious little to support the troops during the war, and now was widely seen as inept. Worst of all, they often failed to pay the soldiers.
You're going to have disgruntled officers serving under him when he has his army stationed up in New York, who are going to say, okay, look, it's time for us to march on Congress. We've been dissed enough, we've been denied enough, it's time for the military to step in here and take over.
Washington acted quickly to stamp out the insurrection in his ranks. On March 15, 1783, he made a surprise appearance at a gathering of army officers in Newburgh, New York.
He had glasses and they were in his pocket, and he fished them out and he put them on and he said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but you can see that in the service of my country, not only am I growing old, but I'm also growing blind as well." And with that one act, with that one stroke, the opposition melted away, and the generals were in tears looking at the man who was their commanding general.
Still, almost everyone believed that Washington would find a way to maintain power. The world watched with a mix of fascination and dread as he traveled to America's temporary capital in Annapolis, Maryland, to meet with Congress.
This was the Cincinnatus moment. Cincinnatus was a great Roman general who was famous for twice coming out of retirement and saving Rome. And then rather than taking power, as so many Roman generals did, he returned to his farm. This became a core of Washington's image. Indeed, that's why you often see statues or old paintings of him dressed in a toga. Washington, to my knowledge, never wore a toga. It wasn't his style, but people dressed him up in the Cincinnatiist myth.
This famous painting in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol shows Washington resigning his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The citizen soldier was returning home to Mount Vernon. In the years after the war, the unity that Washington had so carefully nurtured vanished. The 13 colonies actively competed against each other. Georgia and Rhode Island printed their own money. Vermont conspired with England to join Canada. As support grew for a constitutional convention to reorganize the federal government, Washington agonized over whether to lend his support. A wily politician, he was wary of getting too far ahead of public opinion. For months, he refused to say if he would attend the convention. First, his health wouldn't permit him to travel. Then, it was his mother's health. When he finally arrived in Philadelphia, he was immediately elected presiding officer. The delegates agreed to meet in secret, the better to debate freely.
George Washington quickly appreciated how important this secrecy was, and he enforced it rigorously as presiding officer. One time, for example, when one of the delegates accidentally left one of the key documents, it was found by someone and it was turned into the clerk, and the clerk turned it into Washington. Washington got up and said, this document has gotten out. Who left this? Somebody should come up and claim it. And he threw it down and he marched out. No one had the courage to go up and claim that document.
After a long summer, they emerged with a stunning document, a blueprint for a brand new country. To the dismay of many, the Constitution featured a strong chief executive, a possible tyrant, just like the one they had rebelled against. But everyone knew who the first president would be, and they trusted him. When copies of the Constitution were sent to state houses for ratification, each came with another document.
Every copy had a copy of a letter from George Washington. So if you had any doubts about the Constitution, well, let's just see what George Washington has to say about it. And his endorsement, I think, was very, very important. If you're an anti-ratification guy, you have to explain, okay, George Washington is okay with this, why aren't you?
Washington would become the first president and establish the precedents that guide us still. He chose to be called Mr. President rather than His Excellency or His Highness. He showed that civilian control of the military could work. And after 2 terms, he once again relinquished power and returned to life as a farmer.
And one of the luckiest breaks that we ever had, we Americans, was the leadership of George Washington when it happened. That our first commander-in-chief was the man he was. And remember, he was commander-in-chief of the Army for 8 years, and then he was commander-in-chief as president for 8 years. So he led the country for 16 years. What a marvelous, marvelous human being.
Thomas Jefferson was many things. But most of all, he was a rebel. This one man led 3 revolutions to free America from her colonial bonds, to establish equality for all, and to free men's minds from ancient shackles. To truly appreciate the Declaration of Independence, you must travel back in time. America's founding fathers lived in a world where kings ruled by divine right. A time when no country on earth gave its citizens the freedom to speak or worship as they chose. The founders were determined to usher in a new age. And like a lawyer arguing before a jury, they had to make their case to a skeptical world.
The whole purpose of the Declaration of Independence was a propaganda document. Remember, back then, no colony had ever declared its independence from the mother country before. This was a new act. And they needed to get support from other countries, like France, some of which had colonies. So you had to justify all this.
To prosecute their case, the founders chose a 34-year-old Virginian and lawyer. As the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson pioneered a new vision of equality between individuals and nations.
These 13 little puny colonies are going to insist on their equality to the mighty empire of Britain or France or Spain. So that has to provoke a question, right? In what sense could they possibly think of themselves as equal? You know, it's clearly not in terms of wealth. It's clearly not in terms of military power. So it's exactly one thing, and that is it's simply that they've acquired the capacity for self-government, to organize their own lives. And they have that capacity in the same way that Britain has it, the same way that France has it. So that capacity for self-government is an on-off switch. You either have it or you don't. Once you have it, you're equal to any other nation, organization that has it.
It was a radical step. This former colony would govern itself. But the Declaration went much further, proclaiming that in America, the people rule.
Well, that's not the way anybody thought about it before. If you look at other countries, why does England exist? Why does France exist? They existed because they'd always existed, and the king ruled. And the king's purpose wasn't to establish individual rights of individual people. There was no sense of equality because a king was born a king and nobles were born lords and serfs were born as serfs. And here you have this new notion, a new purpose for a country. This is a ringing document, a noble purpose that forever changed the world.
Think of how the Declaration of Independence begins, when, in the course of human events. We are human beings. History is human. And from all of that, one evolves a new way of giving people control over their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, their happiness.
In an astonishing linguistic sleight of hand, Jefferson promoted universal and timeless principles, while at the same time uniting unruly individuals.
We all have this image that somehow the founders were these men who were etched in marble and that they all got along with each other famously. Well, the fact of the matter is that the founders actually really hated each other.
Jefferson's challenge was to bridge personal and regional divides, to cleverly find common ground with flexible language.
The point of democratic politics is that you achieve a decision where some people go along with it for one reason and other people go along with it for another reason. So consequently, even in our founding documents, there are lots of phrases and ideas that meant different things to different people. The use of pursuit of happiness in the Declaration was an egalitarian idea for somebody like John Adams, who never held slaves, thought slavery was a bad thing. When they wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration and did not use the word property, they were keeping out the key term that slaveholders had begun to use in their defense of slavery. So for Adams and other people who thought slavery was a bad thing, pursuit of happiness was putting a stake in the ground for an egalitarian commitment. Clearly, for the Southerners who were defending slavery, pursuit of happiness was compatible with their own desire to keep slavery. So that phrase, its capaciousness, is part of why it worked. It permitted a compromise, but that also means people had very different interpretations of its meaning.
Jefferson then took a third radical step. Not only would the nation be free, not only would each man control their own life and liberty, they would also have the freedom to think and worship as they chose. Freedom of religion. Contrary to popular belief today, there was no religious freedom in the American colonies. The Puritans wanted freedom to practice their religion, not any other.
At the time of the American Revolution, many states had strict limits on religious freedom. There had never been a mass said in the state of Massachusetts because you couldn't be a Catholic in the state. In colonial Massachusetts, they would hang Quakers because it wasn't part of the state church.
In Virginia, heretics were burned at the stake. But all that ended when Jefferson wrote the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom. His words became a model for the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Jefferson believed that educated, free minds hold the key to human redemption. We have the power to see the truth and remake the world.
Somehow, by using our own reason, that enlightenment power that all of us have, somehow we know this is true. It's not basing it on God. It's not basing it on nature. It's not basing on a grant by a king. No, we as a people, as a rational people, we can see these are self-evident.
Jefferson lived out his final years at his estate in Monticello. At age 83, he was beset by impending bankruptcy, the death of his favorite granddaughter, and his own failing health. Deep in the depths of his suffering, he once again found words to meet the moment. In his very last letter, written days before the 50th anniversary of 1776, he declared a prophetic vision of America's future. May it be to the world the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government, the unbonded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opening to the rights of man.
On nights that were filled with tension, Franklin Roosevelt had this ritual that allowed him to go to sleep. There was a big sledding hill behind his house in Hyde Park, and he loved as a young boy to go down that sledding hill. So in his mind's eye, he'd imagine himself on that sled going down the hill, and at the bottom of the hill, he'd then pick up the sled, come to the top, and then go down again, over and over and over again. Think of it, I mean, here he is paralyzed, not even able to get in and out of the bed on his own power, and yet he's dreaming or imagining in his mind that he's a young boy once more, and somehow that ritual allows him to go to sleep.
At age 38, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a rising political star. The Democratic nominee for Vice President of the United States. At age 39, he was crippled from the waist down, a victim of the polio that would leave his legs paralyzed for the rest of his life.
He had always had this confident, buoyant, optimistic temperament, and yet when the polio came, it was tested severely. He would spend hours, as he said, just trying to move his one toe a little bit. It made him calm and patient in a way that he had not been before. At one point he fell when he was going to a meeting, and he sprawled out on the floor, and then he just got himself up and he said, "I'm okay, guys." He realized that there were going to be embarrassing moments, and they were, but if he got through those, that somehow he could get through the tougher things that were going to happen to him.
In time, he would overcome the toughest possible challenges. He would remake the world and conquer his own limitations. In the America of the 1920s, serious physical handicaps were seen as weak and shameful. It was unheard of for anyone to lead from a wheelchair. But 7 years after contracting polio, Franklin Roosevelt defied the odds and was elected governor of New York.
Once he got to be governor, I think there was a humility that hadn't been there before, and there was a sense of identifying with other people to whom fate had also dealt an unkind hand, because he'd had this incredibly privileged life up until that point. There's no question that it deepened him. It made him a much more interesting person than he would have been before.
FDR's polio made him attuned to the suffering of others. It also helped the average American feel connected to him.
He was a patrician. He was from an old family, had enormous wealth. He had his chin and his lockjaw. And if you're an American living somewhere in the middle of the country, how are you going to relate to this man? The idea that the president himself is struggling with personal trials, this can hearten the American people, can make them say, he's on my side.
As Roosevelt's fortunes rose, the country plunged into a deep and desperate depression. The Great Depression cost millions their life savings. 16 million jobs vanished. In their place, breadlines and starvation. When one economist was asked if there was any historical precedent, he replied, yes. It lasted 400 years and was called the Dark Ages.
The president began this campaign with the same attitude with which he has approached so many of the serious problems of the past 3 years. He sought to create the impression that there was no campaign on at all, just as he had sought to create the impression that all was well with the United States and that there was no depression.
In 1932, a despairing country turned to the jubilant man whose campaign theme song was "Happy Days Are Here Again."
FDR's warm smile and emotional oratory made themselves felt, and he had a ready-made issue. The United States was in the throes of the worst depression in its history. This was Roosevelt's battle cry, and he made the most of it.
He flew through a storm to become the first man ever to accept a presidential nomination in person.
You have nominated me, and I know it, and I am here to thank you for the honor.
No president since Lincoln had faced such a dire crisis.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
FDR's first order of business seemed impossible: solving the banking crisis. He had to restore public confidence and persuade Americans to put their money back into the banking system. A week after taking office, he gave his first fireside chat.
After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
He would give these radio chats, these fireside chats, to all Americans. And in doing so, he was not just their president, he was not just their leader, but most Americans felt that somehow they could persist, that they could go on because they had a friend, and that friend was FDR.
He didn't end the Depression, but what he did do was to alleviate the despair that people were feeling. Because people felt all these bad things are happening and nobody's in charge. Nobody cares about me. What Roosevelt demonstrated is the government does care about you, and we will do something for you. We will fix this.
FDR restored public confidence in the government. But it would take a world war to jumpstart the American economy and transform his place in history.
If World War II hadn't come along, he would have had to retire after 2 terms. And the Depression would have continued. The New Deal would have been vulnerable to attack by Republicans. And so everything that Roosevelt is remembered for would be either non-existent or negative. And he, of course, wouldn't become the great war hero of World War II. So Roosevelt's career and his reputation was rescued by World War II.
Adolf Hitler came to power just weeks before Roosevelt took office as president. Early on, FDR saw Nazi Germany on a collision course with America and the forces of freedom. Even as Hitler's armies overran Europe, most Americans wanted no part of another terrible war.
And they also were still remembering the horrors of World War I, that terrible trench warfare in which an entire generation of young men advanced out only to be mowed down by machine guns and artillery fire. And all for nothing, another war. So why should the United States get involved in another world war?
The imminent danger of war lies in the action taken by President Roosevelt and his supporters.
And polls showed that even in 1941, the American people, by a very large majority, as much as 85%, said, even at the risk of Great Britain falling, the United States should not go to war.
FDR had seen World War I labeled Mr. Wilson's War and was determined not to make the same mistake. In private, he maneuvered to give all possible assistance to Winston Churchill and Great Britain. In public, he insisted on neutrality.
We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army, naval, or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas, except in case of attack.
He promised peace, even as he knew the United States could not avoid war.
The Battle of the Pacific spread today over a 5,000-mile front, following yesterday's shattering and unprovoked attacks by the Japanese on Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and Midway.
He let public opinion build to the point where, when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor by Japan, a clear cause for war, that he didn't even immediately say, okay, this means war. He said, well, we've got to think this over carefully.
Great battleships, 5 years in the building, were horrible wreckage in that many minutes.
Senators and members of the House of Representatives who previously had been skeptical of American involvement in the wars in Europe and Asia, they said, if he doesn't ask us for a declaration of war, we're going to declare war over his opposition. And that's exactly what Roosevelt wanted to happen, because he needed this buy-in of the American people. It had to be America's war.
When war came, he was ready. Patience, fortitude, determination. All the powers he had summoned to surmount polio would serve him well in the dark days ahead.
During Pearl Harbor, when everybody was rushing around as the news was coming, people said that they'd never had more respect for him. He just sat there calmly absorbing the news, saving his anger and all the feelings he was feeling inside for the speech the next day. He had that ability, I think, when things were going around him, and maybe it was the patience and the calmness he'd had to learn from all those years when he was trying unsuccessfully to walk again, to just let the swirl go around him and just remain the rock in the middle of it all.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
What FDR did was he fought for this nation. He lived for this nation. And that's quite a legacy if you think about it. Staring down the Depression, staring down the Nazis, saving democracy.
Eleanor Roosevelt grew up, and always was, very shy, very reserved. Didn't feel comfortable in her own skin as a kid. Here's Eleanor Roosevelt growing up in a family that seemed to, according to her version of it, have every beautiful woman on the planet. She was related to them by blood, and yet she's kind of the ugly duckling.
Like her husband, Eleanor Roosevelt overcame the greatest obstacles life threw at her. By force of will, she transformed a timid young girl into the most influential woman in the world.
Her shyness could have crippled her completely, just as his literally being crippled could have stopped his political career completely. And she's going to tell him, this can't stop you. This cannot stop us.
Franklin Roosevelt taught the world that the only thing to fear is fear itself.
Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
It's a lesson his wife Eleanor learned at an early age. As a young girl, she was awkward and self-conscious, overshadowed by her famous family. Her mother was a Livingston, descended from Scottish nobility. Her father's brother was Teddy Roosevelt, future President of the United States. But Eleanor was determined to face down her fears. At age 20, she plunged into the unknown, marrying her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
When she married Franklin Roosevelt, she became Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. And so she got politics from both sides. And she understood from a fairly early age that she was smart and she had something to contribute, but she didn't know quite how to contribute.
Eleanor soon found herself under the thumb of Franklin's controlling mother, Sarah. When the newlyweds moved to New York City, Sarah bought adjoining townhouses, one for them one for her. Already the odd woman out, Eleanor discovered that Franklin was unfaithful.
There was a family crisis. Franklin Roosevelt had an affair in the 1910s, and Eleanor Roosevelt had to decide whether to leave him or not. And she decided to stick around. And part of it was for the sake of the children, but I think part of it also might have been a recognition that he was going places in politics, and he could take her along. She had a political agenda of her own. She had ideas of how America might be improved.
At age 39, Franklin was struck down by polio. He would never walk again. But thanks to Eleanor's steely determination and unfailing support, his political rise continued. With FDR elected president, the country soon learned it had a new kind of First Lady.
The president's wife taking her exercise astride a horse. It's been a long time since Washington has seen a sight like this, and it looks good.
When World War I veterans had marched on Washington to demand their bonuses, President Hoover sent the Army to disperse them. When the vets returned a year later, FDR sent Eleanor.
They received free quarters, an Army chow at nearby Fort Hunt, and a surprise visit from the First Lady. Mrs. Roosevelt waded through acres of mud to inquire after their welfare, one of many such missions that made her name a byword.
Eleanor played an essential role during the Great Depression, and she was constantly traveling. She traveled all over the country, going to visit people who were in deep poverty and in great need. Now, at the same time, Eleanor was coming back to Washington, and she was telling Franklin, you have to do more. You have to do more.
She comes from a pretty patrician world, and she is comfortable enough to go out and see the sharecropper in the field, and not just go see the miner, but to actually go down into the mine.
Americans knew Eleanor was on their side. She made sure every single letter sent to her was answered by someone in the federal government. She traveled the country tirelessly and fearlessly, becoming the first First Lady to fly.
Very glad to have this opportunity.
And earning the nickname Eleanor Everywhere. When need be, she could hang out with the elites too.
The White House is again the scene of a birthday celebration for the president. At midnight, Mrs. Roosevelt cuts the giant cake, a big slice to actor George Murphy, a little one for little Margaret O'Brien. Joe E. Brown looks hungry, too. The First Lady, in the president's absence, gives his message.
Whatever we can contribute to promote our children's health is an investment in our country's future. It is an assertion of our American birthright to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Eleanor was the president's conscience. She would invite friends to the White House and seat them next to Franklin, the better to bend his ear on behalf of a favorite cause. She held press conferences, open only to women, forcing the major news services to hire their first female reporters. Her White House was like a busy summer camp, with a constant flow of family, friends, and colleagues occupying the upstairs bedrooms. At a time when lynchings were still common in the South, and blacks were second-class citizens everywhere, Eleanor fought for civil rights.
They had kind of this tag team relationship, Eleanor and Franklin. Eleanor would go out there, and she would speak in favor of civil rights reform, an anti-lynching law, and she would say, my husband is with us in his heart, but practical politics prevents him from coming along just yet. And Franklin Roosevelt, when speaking to those conservatives, would sort of throw up his hands and say, oh, the missus, what can you do about her? So they were able to have it both ways, and they became a very effective team.
In 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused permission for singer Marian Anderson to perform before an integrated audience at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. Eleanor promptly resigned from the DAR in protest and moved the concert to the Lincoln Memorial.
It happened. 75,000 people around in front of the Lincoln Memorial and around the reflecting pool, and Marian Anderson singing. It was an extraordinary occasion to see this magnificent opera singer before a huge crowd, black and white, old and young, from all walks of life.
He's got the whole world in his
There'd really been nothing quite like it that had ever happened in the United States before, and it really marked a watershed in American civil rights, and really led to a future in which Martin Luther King could stand in front of the Lincoln Memorial and speak about his dream.
Eleanor began her public life as a stand-in for her husband, but soon learned that people wanted to hear from her.
She wrote newspaper columns for decades. I mean, this begins back in the 30s. She will write 8,000 newspaper columns in her life. This is where battling your shyness to the mat had to take place, or she can't play out these public roles the way that she did. She's always in the public eye. She's always giving speeches. She's always writing. She's projecting herself in so many different ways.
When the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor, Eleanor spoke to the nation within hours, a day before FDR addressed Congress.
Many of you all over this country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America.
Eleanor Roosevelt would become the most famous and significant female voice really in the world. During the war itself, she gave radio addresses, she had her own column, and she was a voice of conscience. She was a voice of morality.
In 1941, Eleanor grabbed a chance to boost the war effort and promote civil rights.
Cadets of the Army Air Corps' first all-black fighter unit are taught and trained at Tuskegee.
Alabama's Tuskegee Institute housed the all-black 99th Fighter Squadron. The unit was an experiment. Many Americans believed that blacks could never be pilots. Eleanor knew better and eagerly boarded a plane flown by Charles Anderson, AKA Chief Anderson.
Despite the Secret Service telling Eleanor not to go up, she flew with him. She flew for more than an hour over the Alabama countryside and came back down to earth, and suddenly the idea that African Americans could be pilots made sense.
At times, Americans grew weary under the burdens of total war. 4 long years of dashed hopes and lost lives. Throughout, Eleanor played a pivotal role in boosting morale.
It was an earnest and hard-working First Lady who visited our boys in the Southwest Pacific, as these pictures just released by the Marine Corps disclose. Informality is the keynote of Mrs. Roosevelt's chats with these wounded boys.
In a nation such as ours, every man who fights for us is in some way our man.
Eleanor would live for 17 years past Franklin. America's first delegate to the United Nations, she became a tireless voice for the voiceless, the driving force behind the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
She often carried her own bag through railroad stations or airports. For her, the cause was everything.
The awkward, painfully shy girl had done more than conquer her fears. In the words of President Truman, she had become First Lady of the world.
And I always like to think of Babe Ruth at St. Mary's Industrial School when he was a kid, where he was, in effect, incarcerated. What gave him the most pleasure? Hitting a baseball over the wall. Leaving St. Mary's Industrial School, leaving his entire life behind. That one moment of pure, unbridled joy where he was outside himself and somebody else.
As America roared into the 1920s, one figure stood above the rest. He was the first modern celebrity, as famous for his feats off the field as on. He was bigger than life and a new kind of role model.
People lived vicariously through Babe Ruth, not only for what he did on the field, which was enough, but they also lived vicariously through him through the life he lived.
The fun-loving Babe was a gold mine of news for the baseball writers of his time.
They knew that he was living the high life. They knew that he was going out every night, that he was driving cars too fast, that he was, not always taking care of his body, but that he was experiencing the 1920s in the way that everybody wished and hoped they could.
In a land divided by race, class, gender, and ethnicity, one man transcended it all.
From kids to grandmothers, didn't matter if you were rich, didn't matter if you were poor, Babe Ruth spoke to everyone. And he was comfortable with everyone. There's so many wonderful photographs where you see Ruth just surrounded by gaggles of people. And he's this beaming center, this sun in the middle of everything. And everybody else is like basking in the glow of Babe Ruth. Look, he's here. And Babe looks like he's the happiest person of them all.
But for an accident of history, George Herman Ruth would today be remembered, if at all, as a leading pitcher of his day. In 1917, America's entry into World War I triggered a draft and left baseball short-handed. Ruth, a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, jumped at the chance to try his hand as an outfielder. He was untrained at the plate and quickly developed his own unique hitting style.
All of a sudden, he starts hitting these bombs, going over the fence. Fans are stunned. His teammates are stunned. Ruth loves it. This is fun. This is a lot better than pitching.
The experiment changes Ruth's whole career. He becomes the slugger. A home run that day, another the next. In 6 days, he's leading the league in hitting.
Where everybody else was just trying to meet the ball, Babe was swinging from the heels. He took these massive cuts, holding the bat at the very end, trying to hit the ball as far and hard as he could.
Before Ruth, outfield fences were to keep crowds off the field. He made them barricades to hit the ball over. Seemingly overnight, America was entranced by this new brand of baseball. Dispatches to homesick troops in Europe carried the scores of games and reports of each Ruthian four-bagger. Among those taking notice was New York Yankees owner and beer baron Jacob Ruppert. With Prohibition fast approaching, he saw Ruth as his new meal ticket and snapped up the young slugger for $125,000.
When he wrapped his hands around a bat and got his feet set right, great things could happen.
Babe arrived in New York at the dawn of the Roaring '20s. The city had just become electrified and was open 24/7 for fun and games. It was the golden age of Broadway, with speakeasies and nightclubs on every corner.
Ruth came to New York, and it was suddenly as if he found his stage. This was a place where he could be himself in all dimensions. And let's remember, at that time, most games were played at 3 in the afternoon. They only lasted a couple of hours. What are you going to do from 5 o'clock until 3 the next afternoon? Babe had a pretty good idea.
And of course, there was the Babe, the greatest figure of them all. Even Junior will admit that. The Yankee Stadium was a house that Ruth built, and the nation idolized the big man with the toothpick legs, the Sultan of Swan, who could wallop them out of the park.
Babe and the New York press were a match made in heaven. He gave newspapers and magazines endless supplies of good copy. They made him bigger than the biggest movie stars.
Total attendance on this day, 74,000, the biggest baseball crowd yet. Standing, kneeling in the aisles, hanging from the rafters.
You could go to the ball game, you could read about Babe Ruth. You could read what he did on the field, what he did off the field.
He does it. Sets a record not to be broken for decades. Unbelievable, but true.
And you could imagine, I could do that. I used to play baseball. My kids play baseball. This is something that really set a model for modern celebrities. Can you imagine that you could know this person? Maybe even aspire to be like this person. We're not talking about George Washington here. You couldn't be George Washington unless you were born George Washington, but you might become Babe Ruth.
Fans were so intrigued with him that every snippet of news, they wanted to know what Babe was doing. How many times did Babe strike out? Did he fall down when he missed the pitch? Was he late to the game? All this stuff. They wanted to know every single thing about him.
For centuries, celebrity had been about virtue or skill. Now, it was about personality. Babe was the first athlete to hire an agent and the first to make more money off the field than on it. He grabbed every opportunity to exploit his fame. His agent made him available for personal appearances, merchandise endorsements, exhibition baseball games, vaudeville, moving pictures, radio, and all forms of commercial contract.
When Babe wasn't banging out baseballs, he was banging out tunes.
Home run! Home two! It's a home run!
As the 1920s went into overdrive, radio spread like wildfire, and newsreels accompanied movies. All this new media made the Babe bigger than ever.
Every newsreel would feature what Babe Ruth did that week, what home run he hit. Or if he didn't hit a home run, how many times did he strike out? And look at him spinning around and falling over into the dirt after taking a mighty swing and missing. That was almost as good as hitting a home run.
Babe shared a special bond with children. Their connection was real and hyped to legendary levels by an obliging press corps.
The idol of American youth, Babe Ruth. How the kids loved him.
In one famous tale, Immortalized in the movie The Babe Ruth Story, Babe delivers on a promise to slug a homer for the sick boy, Johnny Sylvester.
Did it really happen? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Was it framed as this miraculous act by this beneficent god, Babe Ruth? Yeah, that's how the press presented it because that made the better story. What they wouldn't tell you is Babe probably promised to hit a home run for every kid he ever met. Kids loved Babe Ruth. He loved them. It was not uncommon for Babe, after a game, to see some kids playing in a sandlot, stop, take off his coat, and play with them.
The New York Times called Babe as natural a showman as P.T. Barnum. Asked how he felt about making more money than President Hoover, he replied, "Well, I had a better year than he did." Everyone wanted to meet him and have their photo taken with him.
After Babe retired, at that point, he wanted to stay in baseball.
In the stands, Babe Ruth sits this one out.
And he wanted to become a manager. He thought that he'd earned the right to do that.
It's an honor here to present some of my trophies. I got about 1/3 of them here, and I wish you could see them all.
That's where his personality and his behavior over the course of his career kind of came back to bite him, because they didn't think he was managerial material. They didn't think that he could enforce the rules that he'd never paid any attention to.
A century after he transformed baseball, celebrity culture, and the American experience, the Babe remains.
That was the year the Babe knocked out 60 home runs.
One of a kind.
Anybody who reaches the top of their profession is often described as the Babe Ruth of X or the Babe Ruth of Y. We still talk about, going for the home run. That's the great metaphor, which is to try to do something that can't be done. Baseball scouts to this day, when they go out, what are they looking for? They're looking for the next Babe Ruth. That guy who can hit like Babe Ruth, and maybe that guy that can transform the game and change America.
The secret of Twain's success was that he echoed and reflected a longing of all sorts of people. Millions of Americans saw the old ways disappearing and these new ways coming fast. And so they seek refuge in an earlier time. Childhood, and that rural childhood, that small town childhood, was especially precious to Americans then because it was clearly disappearing from their lives. They knew that their own children would not have such a childhood because America had changed. What Twain did was to evoke an earlier America.
As the 20th century dawned, Mark Twain was the most popular voice in America, the Oprah of his day. His white suit, crazy hair, big mustache, and ever-present cigar were all part of a carefully calculated public persona that made him one of the first modern celebrities. In 1900, as today, many who have never read a word of his writing know him on sight.
He liked being in the public eye. He liked having his photograph taken, which he did all the time, in every imaginable circumstance. This isn't just about being out in the public eye and posing with someone because you're sharing a lectern or something like that. He did a lot of that. But this is bringing in photographers in his own home. Here's a photograph of Mark Twain playing pool with one of his daughters. Here's Mark Twain sitting on the front porch of his house with the family dog and all the girls sitting around him.
The people and the press loved him. In an age when newspapers were the only mass medium, Twain found a way to grace their pages as constantly as reality stars appear on magazine covers today.
And he was great about what we would call today the soundbite. He could come into some place and be surrounded by reporters. Mr. Twain, what do you think about X? What do you think about the election coming up? These kinds of things. And he would, cigar in hand, pontificate for it, just enough to make sure that he could work his way into the newspaper that day.
Decades before he was famous for being famous, Mark Twain shaped American culture by creating some of our most enduring works of fiction.
My plan has been to pleasantly remind adults of what they once were themselves, how they felt and thought and talked, and what queer enterprises they engaged in. Preface to the Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
Twain idealized rural American life and made Americans yearn to return to an idyllic time that for most people never existed. In the 1800s, rural families lived hard-scrabble lives, and their children toiled long and hard just to put food on the table. In Tom Sawyer, Twain created the adventurous and carefree childhood Americans wished they had experienced. Twain's themes and characters were uniquely American. He pioneered the use of regional dialects and set his tales in what was already becoming known as the Heartland. No less than Ernest Hemingway declared that American literature begins with Huckleberry Finn. Today, we would call Huck a juvenile delinquent. His odd couple adventure takes him down the Mississippi River with the slave, Jim.
And now you've got this kid from the river, this river rat, narrating the story about something as important as what I should feel about slavery. That really challenges the norms of the day, in that you can make your narrator a kid, and you, as an adult writer, can say whatever you want to about slavery and not run the risk of offending as easily because, after all, this is just a kid saying this from an ignorant viewpoint. It's a genius way to do it, I think.
Huck has been taught that all African Americans are subhuman, but he overcomes his background and makes the courageous decision to stand with his friend Jim. Huck's journey of discovery comes straight out of Twain's own life.
In my school days, I had no aversion to slavery. I was not aware there was anything wrong about it. The local paper said nothing against it. The local pulpit taught us that God approved it, that it was a holy thing.
Twain could approach the darkest topics with the lightest and most humorous of touches.
He's not giving a sermon, he's telling a story and letting readers draw their own morals. There's no more serious subject than slavery and racial inequality and the boys coming of age of all this. But to read the story, you don't get that. What you get is this unusually knowing perspective of this young boy who is seeing through the pretenses of society.
Twain wanted his say, but he also yearned for riches and fame.
My books are like water. Those of the great writers are like wine. Fortunately, everybody drinks water.
He was always on the lookout for ways to boost his sales and increase his notoriety.
Twain was one of the first to sell books by subscription, basically to go around to bookstores and even to solicit individuals who would agree ahead of time, I'll buy the book. This was a revolutionary idea from the standpoint of the publisher, because publishers don't want to print any more books than they can sell. If they've already known that we've sold 200,000, whatever it is, they print that number, and they hit their mark and they maximize their profit.
Literature had been a luxury reserved for the rich and well-educated. Twain's popular themes and clever marketing opened fiction to the masses. He would spend his long life poking a stick at injustices in American culture, while at the same time benefiting from his celebrity. In the years after the Civil War, Twain cast a dark eye on the greed and corruption running rampant in Washington, D.C. He named and chastised the era in his novel, The Gilded Age.
There is no distinctly Native American criminal class, except Congress. I can say with pride, that we have legislators that bring higher prices than any other in the world.
Even as he mocked the hypocrisies of the rich, he made himself an ever-appreciating asset.
He was constantly in need of money, and celebrity was a good way to make sure that the funds flowed. And when he ran out of money, he went out on the road. He lectured. He lectured throughout the United States. He lectured throughout Europe. Twain really understood the value of creating an image in the public eye that few Americans prior to this had really been able to see.
Twain was ready, willing, and eager to sell himself or anything else. He happily endorsed typewriters, sewing machines, cigars, scrapbooks, and fountain pens.
He is a guy who loves to pitch products. He's living in a time period where public figures could be approached with, would you endorse this box of cigars? And they would, no, I'm not that guy. That's a sordid commercial enterprise. I'm above that. And Twain was, sign me up, sign me up. What, do I get free cigars when I do this?
Mark Twain's imagination created worlds at once unique and universal. Each generation delights anew in his enduring wit and timeless fancy.
When I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it had happened or not. But my faculties are decaying, and soon I will not remember any but the things that never happened.
Edison, as an adult, would say he had not heard songbirds sing since he was 12 years old. He had hearing issues from childhood on, and he was practically deaf most of his adult life. When you can create something that replicates a sense, what an extraordinary piece of technology that is. You've created something that recreates a specific sound. Your voice, her song, those songbirds. You have a sense that's been limited for so long, and now just turn up the volume.
Consider the modern cell phone, a wonder of innovation. Nearly all its functions, visual imaging, audio recording, music playback, light, electricity, were popularized by one man. Thomas Edison had no small ego and liked to promote himself as a lone inventor. the wizard of Menlo Park. But his true genius was organizational. He built the first research and development laboratory, decades before the federal government or corporate America followed his lead. Eventually, an astonishing 5,000 scientists, engineers, and laborers brought his visions to life.
You can't take out 1,100 patents in your lifetime by yourself. He's employing very creative guys who are brought in and told, there are no rules here, just create. Just get as creative as you can. And he would put a problem in front of them. I want a machine that can do this. And then off they go.
He was the model of somebody, the inventor, who made the transition into the business world. And this is the secret of modern business successes like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. They have the ideas, they start out as almost this lone inventor. But the ones who make it big and have the big influence on the world are the ones who can carry a really good idea into the marketplace and then make it available to millions of people.
The first words I spoke in the original phonograph, a little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
Edison took full credit for any and all creations of his shop. He drove his team relentlessly through 6- and 7-day work weeks. But he also toiled in the trenches, inspiring his men to go the extra mile.
I think it's important that he's not employing them as management and then there's labor. He's working with them, and I think that's crucial. They got along with this guy. They liked their boss. He brings in a pipe organ to the lab so that they can sit around later in the day and somebody can play the organ, they can have sing-alongs together. Well, that doesn't sound like most jobs that I've been a part of anyway.
When Edison coined the phrase, invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, he was speaking from first-hand experience.
His style of engineering was brute force type of engineering. Try this, let's try this. Let's do it until we find out what works. What he did was he kept trying different materials until he finally got the right material, the right atmosphere within the light bulb, so that it became a practical tool.
Edison was determined to develop a commercial light bulb, and he needed a filament that could burn for an extended period without consuming itself. His team tried everything: horsehair, coconut fiber, fish line, spider webs. More than 6,000 materials were tested before he settled on carbonized bamboo. Edison was in a never-ending race with other inventors to be the first. He was forever suing competitors, claiming they had stolen his ideas. In 1884, Nikola Tesla arrived in the United States from Budapest with a letter of introduction to Edison. The two inventors quickly became bitter rivals.
You had these two different models of scientific development. Tesla went out on his own and set up very small labs focused on individual projects that he was interested in and pursued them, while Edison had this very large-scale industrial throughput effort to come up with answers.
They battled over the best method of delivering electricity. Tesla favored alternating current, or AC. Edison promoted direct current, DC, and was not above some flim-flam to manipulate public opinion.
He began holding these demonstrations to try to show how dangerous alternating current was. And he literally put an elephant on a metal platform and then ran a huge amount of electricity and electrocuted this poor beast in order to provide a shocking demonstration of just how dangerous alternating current was. But of course, what he didn't say was that direct current would have done exactly the same thing or even worse.
The current war, as it came to be known, reached its climax at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Chicago's Beaux Arts White City wowed visitors from around the globe, awestruck by the dazzling illumination provided by Tesla's AC. Edison had lost the battle, but would win the legacy war. His name became synonymous with electricity. And electricity transformed the Earth. The Industrial Revolution passed in two waves. Steam power changed how things were made, but electrical power changed how we lived. Cheap, easily available power in the home makes modern life possible. Washing machines, radios, television, and eventually the internet. As light spread across the globe, humans by the millions were drawn like moths to the flame to the lights of the big city.
Once they've seen the bright lights of the city, how are you going to get them back down on the farm? The cities in those days had bright lights when no place else did. And they operated like a magnet to draw people from overseas, to draw people from farms to the cities. Because all of a sudden, a city that's brightly lit is this exciting place to be. When you can light up the night, then cities can become these 24-hour-a-day operations. It utterly changes the nature of modern life.
Old newsreels of Edison often show him cupping his hand to an ear, struggling to hear. From age 12 onward, he suffered severe hearing loss. Perhaps it's no surprise that he called the phonograph his favorite invention.
Deaf himself from a blow on the ear received as a boy, Edison turned his attention to the field of sonic engineering, and under his magic touch, the grandfather of our modern-day phonographs appeared. Using wax cylinders to record and preserve the sound, the Edison gramophone again opened up a brand new field of endeavor and a prosperous industry that was to make billions for its management.
When you can recreate sound and amplify the sound too, so that he could hear things, well, I would think that would be your favorite invention, because you have a sense that's been limited for so long, and now just turn up the volume. I think it'll be extraordinary.
Many Americans fighting in World War I had never journeyed beyond their hometown. Suddenly, they found themselves in a strange land, thousands of miles from home, with Germans across the trenches trying to kill them. Those soldiers treasured any reminder of home, none more so than music played on Edison's phonograph. When the war finally ended, the normally reserved American commander, General Blackjack Pershing, was ready for a celebration.
Right at the end of the war, when they came down to the front and announced that the war was over, Germans had surrendered, he got a hold of one of these phonographs and cranked it up, and he danced to the music, which Pershing would never do on a normal day.
As with so many other innovations, Edison did not invent the motion picture camera, but he did improve and popularize it. The world's first movie studio was 3,000 miles from Hollywood in West Orange, New Jersey. Edison Studios started as a black box with no ceiling. Across 20 years, it would produce nearly 1,200 films.
Edison is the one who makes the modern motion picture industry possible. He's the one who realizes that you can freeze action on film and then replay it. So just as his phonograph froze speech for playing later, his motion picture devices froze pictures to be shown later.
He's always the guy who invents something with an understanding of this has to be marketable in some way, used in some practical way, and then I want to be the guy who does that too. There's what we call vertical integration to what Edison does. He invents it, and then he creates the company that makes it, and then he creates the company that sells it.
As the 20th century dawned, millions of immigrants came to America, dreaming of a better life in a land where anything was possible. Whether they hailed from Russia, Germany, or Ireland, they knew all about a world-famous symbol of freedom. Not the Statue of Liberty, not any flag or natural feature. Their first glimpse of the new world was made possible by Thomas Edison. The dazzling lights of Coney Island.
When I look around at the resources of the electrical field today, I feel that I would be glad to begin again my work as an electrician.
As a young boy, Walt Disney would hear train whistles roar through his small Midwestern town and dream of distant lands.
To Walt Disney, trains meant freedom. The trains were a place where he could step on the train and it could take him anywhere in the world. It could take him off to France for World War I, it could take him to Los Angeles, so that was his jet plane. And so trains meant something more than just trains to Walt. He installed one in his backyard in Holmby Hills and had an amazing train outlet in his backyard. And the amazing thing at Disneyland was Walt Disney himself owned the trains and the monorail. So if you worked at Disneyland in the 60s or 70s and you were on the steam locomotive, you got your paycheck from Walt Disney, not from the Disney company. But that's how important trains were to Walt and why Disneyland was such a huge expression of that love of independence of trains. That's why a train circles all the Disney parks.
Walt came to Los Angeles during the Roaring '20s, a time of energy and optimism. Eager to make his mark, he created the animated character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald had real personality. Here was a rabbit audiences could root for. He was Walt's first big hit and his first crushing disappointment when his business partners stole the rights. Walt feared his career was over. Then, on a long train trip from New York to Los Angeles, inspiration struck.
He loved the idea of the mouse, and he thought, Mortimer Mouse, it's going to be fantastic. Everybody's going to love Mortimer Mouse. And his wife said, that's a really sucky name. Let's go with something different. And they ended up with Mickey Mouse.
The mouse, as Walt came to call him, would conquer the world. In Europe, Mickey becomes as popular as Charlie Chaplin. Churchill, Mussolini, and Hitler have one thing in common. They all watch Mickey Mouse cartoons.
And Walt goes to Europe in 1935. He carries around this big 3-foot stuffed Mickey Mouse with him. He goes to London. Everybody goes, that's Walt Disney holding that big Mickey Mouse. So not only does Mickey become a hero, but Walt, just in his kind of gift for marketing and self-promotion, gets everybody to know who he is and that he's the papa of Mickey Mouse.
Hello, Mickey. Hello to Mr. Aylesworth, Mickey.
Hello, Mr. Aylesworth. How are you?
Walt has another brainstorm. If 5-minute cartoons can have such impact, what could he accomplish with an animated feature? It was a daring idea, and many called it crazy.
Nobody really made an animated feature. And in fact, there was some kind of conjecture about whether you could sit and watch animation for that long. Would your head explode? Would it be something that was, really annoying? Would you get a headache?
Walt chooses the classic fairy tale Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In the middle of the Great Depression, he spends millions to bring his vision to the screen. The project became known as Disney's Folly. On December 21st, 1937, Walt watched with dread as the film premiered at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. Would his gamble pay off? Would his movie and his fledgling company go under?
They're just sitting there with flop sweat going, I hope it works. And by the time they got to the end of the movie and Snow White had died and was in her glass coffin and the dwarfs were weeping at her feet, the audience started sniffing and crying, and they thought, oh my God. They're sniffing and reacting and crying emotionally to drawings on the screen.
No one had ever seen anything like it. By focusing on character and story, Disney showed that audiences could connect with animated characters as much as human ones. Snow White becomes one of the biggest moneymakers of all time. Walt finds himself on the cover of Time magazine, and the Motion Picture Academy presents him with 8 Oscars, 1 full-size and 7 miniatures. Basking in the glow of his success, Walt bets the house on a series of animated features, only to find his dreams shattered by a world in chaos.
Walt had spent $3 million building a new studio in Burbank and spent all of his money on Pinocchio, Bambi, Dumbo, Fantasia, and they were $4 million in debt. And World War II happened, and a huge labor strike happened that walked all the animators off of his lot. So he lost everything.
After the war, Walt looks to the future and new technologies to rebuild his company.
Television can be competition, yes. In other words, it's a medium that can keep people in their homes instead of get them out. But again, if you have the right kind of films, the people go out.
Other studios see television as the enemy, come to steal their audience. But Walt sees fresh opportunities.
Television destroyed lots of movie careers. People didn't know how to segue from one to the other. But Walt Disney understood that this opens up new possibilities. It didn't destroy the old ones, it added to them. And he was able to make that transition.
In an era when science fiction portrayed invading aliens bent on destruction, Disney's TV shows present a wondrous vision of the future.
Disney tapped into this belief, especially after World War II, with the development of rockets and the space age, that the future is really going to be different. We're going to be able to do different things.
Years before JFK says, let's go to the moon, Walt says, let's go to the moon and Mars too. Disney's TV productions generated the money and publicity Walt needed to pursue his greatest ambition. He takes all the tools of filmmaking, lighting, actors, costumes, music, and sound, and uses them off the screen. Just as Snow White had wowed audiences with its dramatic story and memorable characters, Disneyland takes visitors on an emotional journey.
So you go down and see the castle at the end of Main Street, and then you're given this beautiful choice of places to go. Well, you don't just walk into Frontierland, you cross-dissolve into Frontierland. So you cross a bridge, and there's water, and then there's a fort. And then you go into the fort and you start to hear sounds of the Old West. And there's a shooting gallery and a place where you can buy a coonskin hat. And so suddenly through this cross dissolve from Main Street, you're in the Old West. These were narratives. They were complete stories. Nobody did that. That was really fresh, and that was a way to experience it in a way that emotionally connected with the audience. So it wasn't just a theme park ride or a roller coaster. It was a gut-level reaction to the personalities and narrative that existed in these parks. And that was what was so special about Walt Disney. He was a storyteller.
He was also a brilliant and pioneering businessman. The corporate branding and cross-promotion that dominate entertainment in the 21st century, it all comes from Walt Disney.
Mickey Mouse was a movie character, an animated movie character. And then on television, there's the Mickey Mouse Club. And then the Mouseketeers can take you to Disneyland, where you can see all the other Disney characters come to life. And so there's a nice circle here, and you can enter the circle anywhere. So if you first come in at television, then you're guided to Disneyland. Maybe you'll go watch the movies, or if you first come in at Disneyland, you'll go watch the movies and the TV shows.
Time is the friend of Walt Disney. Mickey Mouse just turned 90, and he looks as young as ever, even as each new generation experiences his charms.
He really wanted his characters to live and have personalities and walk and live and breathe and be believable. Even though they were made out of paint and pencils, they had to be believable. And that's why you want to own one. That's why you want to take Winnie the Pooh home and put it on your bed, is because you believe Winnie the Pooh exists. And maybe he does. And that's a real magic of Walt Disney.